Well, welcome everybody to the Keith and Nadine Pierce lecture, our Columbus Museum of Art annual guest lecture program dedicated to topics in American art. I'm David Stark, Chief Curator Emeritus at the Columbus Museum of Art, and it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Jody Patterson, who is the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation Associate Professor of History of Art at Ohio State University. She's also Chair of Art History and Chair of Graduate Studies, wearing many hats, and I'm sure very, very busy. Jody received her PhD at University College London and has served as the Terra Foundation Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. She's also been the inaugural teaching fellow at the National Institute of Art History in Paris. She's taught internationally at institutions that include the Slade School of Fine Art, the École Normale Supérieure, and the University of Plymouth, England. Despite her vast international experience, Dr. Patterson's focus is on 20th century American art, and her special interest is the relationship between art and politics. Her articles have appeared in journals such as Art History, the Oxford Art Journal, Tate Papers, and American Art. Today, Dr. Patterson will be speaking to us on material from her recently published book, Modernism for the Masses, Painters, Politics, and Public Murals in 1930s New York. This book is published by Yale University Press, and there are not very many, but copies available in the museum shop, which Dr. Patterson tells me she'd be delighted to sign if you wish to linger after the lecture. I should conclude by saying that Dr. Patterson is working on yet another book with a provocative title, What About Modern Art and Democracy? Won't you please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Jody Patterson.
The unmasking by prior arrangement. I'm far enough from all of you that it should be okay. Thank you for such a warm and lovely introduction, David. I can say from the bottom of my heart, it is such a delight to be here today. This is my first time speaking in a public environment such as this in over 3 years. I think we can all guess why. So being able to see actual faces and enjoy the sort of sense of collectivism is one of the great things about being able to share ideas. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. And it also gives me the opportunity to publicly offer some thanks. On the one hand, as David mentioned, to the Terra Foundation of Art, who has been a long-standing supporter, not only of my research in American art, but internationally in support of bringing to light historical American art. So we don't even know what history means. I just saw a history of art class where the 1980s were considered historical. And I wanted to just sort of curl under my sofa and never come out again. And also, as this is the sort of first public unveiling of the book, which like many books, took more than a decade to actually research and write, I'm so pleased to have the actual object in front of me and to be able to thank the editorial team at Yale University Press, who are just, each and every one of them, outstanding. And for a book such as this, where most of the artworks are really unknown, and even trying to find within archival collections images of these arts, so many of which were destroyed or lost. It's really important that the book is illustrated, and they make beautiful books. And also the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, who so generously created a chairship in art history at The Ohio State University, which I'm very proud to have taken up that chairship. I should also note, certainly as one of them is in the audience, I'm not actually the chair of the History of Art department. Our previous chair, Professor Lisa Florman, is here, and Carl, if you're out there, Carl Whittington is our current chair, but I do chair graduate studies, something which I enjoy very much. So without further ado, when I wrote this book, I didn't need glasses, but I do now. Much has changed, so here we go. I also need a string around them so that I don't lose them. So there we are as well. And I'm aware that I'm not wearing a mask, but you are. So I certainly don't intend to bombard you for an hour with my thoughts on this topic. But I certainly will welcome questions afterwards and want to try to share with you some of the enthusiasm that I have for this material. Okay. In today's talk, I'd like to circle back in many ways to where my work on the 1930s left off. And I want to explore not only the unprecedented support for art during the tumultuous years of the Great Depression, but also the legacies of public art in the immediate aftermath of the war. Legacies which in many ways continue to define our engagement with culture today. Recent social, political, and economic upheavals, not to mention a continuing pandemic, have spurred renewed interest in the 1930s, another period in American history marked by crisis and uncertainty in which the nation and its institutions were sorely tested. Though I am an art historian, my interest in the 30s is not limited to strictly aesthetic concerns. And if you're hoping for finely grained formal analyses of artworks, you will be sorely disappointed today. I'm trying to give a broader sense of the context. I'm equally interested in trying to understand what role art and artists play within a democracy. And these questions are still, I think, very much pertinent today. For some, art is a dispensable luxury of interest only to an elite few. But for others, culture is a cornerstone of a democratic way of life. And I'm just showing you here a poster from those WPA projects, part of the poster division that was set up under the WPA, Shall the Artists Survive? And this was a sort of town hall thinking about the ways in which government support, community interest groups could support the making of art and the support of artists. So as many of you will already be aware, President Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933 when the Depression was at its peak and its effects at their most severe. Since the stock market crash in 1929, unemployment had increased from 4% to over 25%, and the GDP per capita fell by approximately 30%. Worse was yet to come. FDR rejected the laissez-faire approach of his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, and his New Deal administration immediately set about enacting a series of regulatory and relief measures to alleviate the plight of all Americans. And I'm showing you here the symbol, which you can see incorporates aspects of the flag, the government, the WPA, and also an artist's easel with a paintbrush. And then artists together, like any other essential workers, like laborers being paid on the rolls in 1939 as part of a community WPA project. Art was a key facet of the president's efforts to restore faith in government's fundamental role to provide economic opportunity, employment, and decent living conditions. And of course, this was an interventionist approach rather than laissez-faire, which doesn't suit all voters and all of those in Senate or Congress. But for Roosevelt, art was not superfluous to the country's most exigent needs. In a move that remained controversial amongst his adversaries, he made the radical decision to channel federal resources into cultural projects across the country. So what I'll be referring to when I say WPA, some of you will be aware that the New Deal was a sort of melting pot of alphabet agencies. So the key ones that I'll be speaking about, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and even more importantly, the Federal Art Project, which was under the umbrella of the WPA. We have an overview of the projects here from 1936. So under the New Deal, access to culture and freedom of artistic expression, to which I'll return, were the inalienable rights of every American citizen. The first of the federally funded programs was launched in 1933. 2 years later, the WPA was established. The Federal Art Project, and again under its aegis, focused on the visual arts and was the largest of 5 projects that included programs for music, theater, and writing. Many Americans encountered their first original artworks, received their first art instruction, listened to their first concerts, and attended their first theater performances under the auspices of government-sponsored projects. And you can, I'm not sure how visible it is from where you're seated, but total employment in 1936, so this is actually a few months after the programs have gotten underway, 5,219, and we can see in terms of fine arts, practical arts, education, miscellaneous, it wasn't just making murals, which I'm interested in, but there were all kinds of projects dedicated to sculpture, to photography, to touring exhibitions. So some towns, any town with a population of more than 500, so they'd have a Ford dealership, and now maybe an art exhibition, art instruction. For example, the Harlem Community Art Centers, which brought art instruction to a whole new generation of children, all came under the auspices of the FAP. What we're looking at here, this is FDR in one of his sort of characteristic fireside chats. So he would weekly sit down. He made the best possible use of the radio as a means of coming literally into people's homes, joining them perhaps at the dinner hour on a Sunday, and letting the nation know how it was faring. And this is, again, one of the posters made under the Federal Art Project. So in one of his radio addresses, Roosevelt insisted that support for democracy and for the arts must be one and the same. By encouraging the creation and enjoyment of artistic culture, democracy itself was strengthened. And the resonances here are not just for the United States, but of course we need to be thinking more broadly on the international front about what was going on in the 1930s. So of course we have the rise to power of fascism, communism, and so for democracy to be associated with widespread access to culture, and as I'll talk about in a moment, also with a modern kind of art, not just looking back to neoclassical or figurative norms, was key to how the nation wanted itself to be identified internationally. So of course, it can't happen here. We read books instead of burning them. And that obviously making a reference, there we go, to culture under the Nazi regime. And what I'm showing you here, many of you will be familiar with the Degenerate Art exhibition that was mounted in Munich in 1937, a gathering up of all different forms of modern art, so expressionism, abstractions, bits of surrealism, and very much the purpose here was to evacuate its credibility, to poke fun at this as degenerate. And then this also offered some of the last glimpses of these artworks before they were subsequently destroyed. So what's more, with the Nazi prescription of modern art as degenerate, the embrace of modernism on a public scale in the US became a powerful international symbol of the nation's commitment to anti-fascism. And as I've just suggested, the Degenerate Art exhibition offered a tour through the art that the National Socialist Party had rejected on ideological grounds. The exhibition sought to ridicule art and artists that were not considered to be Aryan. And as I say, much of the artwork was subsequently destroyed. I really want to go backwards and not forwards, and I think that's because I'm a historian. Okay, so another one of the posters that was made under the auspices of the Federal Art Project, a comparative report, again, just giving you a sense of the variety and diversity of activities that were undertaken. And we can see here at this point July 1936. Already we have 955 community murals that have been produced. And I should add that what I'm looking at today, the Federal Art Project, is only one of several different projects that created murals during the 1930s. Another dedicated to those buildings that were deemed government buildings, like all around the Capitol in Washington, had another mural program, and that was the Treasury section. Okay, so my interest in the 1930s has primarily been with the WPA's mural division. Murals, I want to argue, and as you know, what seemed to be perfectly relevant at the time, are an ideal form of public art that can engage a far more diverse audience than the private culture of the easel painting. And of course, if we think of the easel painting sequestered in people's homes or in the sort of rarefied environs of the museum, so public mural painting out there and part of everyone's sort of daily experience. And I just wanted to point out that everyone loved murals in the 1930s. So I'm showing you here two examples of fascist murals from a really prominent display that was in Paris at the International Exhibition in 1937. And I think that we can see, in addition to these being monumental paintings, a return to a very anti-modernist visual vocabulary. So looking back to the figure, to neoclassicism, and certainly in the case of Hitler's preferences to the male, muscle-bound Aryan figure. Okay, so by 1936, nearly 1,000 murals had already been painted for public spaces, including, but not limited to, schools, hospitals, libraries, and post offices. More than 2,500 murals had been completed across the country by the close of the WPA in 1943, when the US shifted its resources towards the war effort. So again, just giving you a sense of the activities. And sharing with you one of my favorite prints. This is actually a very modest etching and aquatint, but speaks to the idea of, if the artist had been out there, part of the community, working with people in the streets. This is suggesting, of course, the return to the ivory tower. The artist is now focused entirely on the easel, on what's in front of him. And we've got planes and bombing and all manner of chaos just outside the window, of which he's paying no heed whatsoever. So tranquility. Historical assessments of the New Deal began to emerge during the Cold War era, when public art was widely associated with a wholly discredited Soviet culture. So not just being associated with Soviet culture in terms of public art, but actually Stalinist culture. And so this was one of the big problems with the New Deal initiatives in the Cold War period. As the US assumed global dominance across political, economic, and military fronts, many establishment ideologues responded to the McCarthyist witch hunts by recoiling from the now repugnant pinkish collectivism of the New Deal era. They opted instead to celebrate the virtues of American exceptionalism and the triumph of individualism. Much of my own work has been geared toward recuperation of the alternatives offered to artists and audiences during the 1930s. And certainly that's what the research and thinking behind the book encapsulates. This was a decade when some of the most sophisticated modernists in the US were creating large-scale paintings for shared spaces where they could be encountered, again, as part of daily experience. So many of you will be familiar with Willem de Kooning, whose celebrated status emerged with the New York School, the abstract expressionists. But like so many of his generation, he came of age on these WPA projects. And what I'm showing you here is one of his mural studies for the Williamsburg Housing Project in Brooklyn. And I'll return to that housing project in a moment. And also Lee Krasner, another artist whose reputation was sort of galvanized as part of the New York School as an abstract expressionist. I dare say as the wife of Jackson Pollock, but hopefully we're beyond all of that. And her study as well for the Williamsburg Housing Project. As Lee Krasner observed at the close of the projects in 1943, murals of the 1930s were created for communities rather than individuals and were designed for democratic consumption. She was amongst many modernists who actively lobbied for the continuation of the WPA during the post-war era. And indeed, artists continued to lobby well into the early 1950s. Krasner, like so many of her generation, lamented the artist's return to the isolation of the studio and their renewed alliance on a market-driven model of art, which valued artworks as commodities rather than as a shared public resource. Again, Arashel Gorky, another well-known member of the New York School, worked on quite a well-known now mural project for the building of the new terminal in Newark at the Newark airport. So I'm showing you a color study. And then of course with mural painting, size and scale, the embrace of the human figure in terms of your field of vision, just to give you a sense of just how big these things were. The renewed emphasis on art as a private commodity produced by and for a select few was fully retrenched in the US by the 1950s. And I might add that this market-driven model of art has yet to be dislodged. In the wake of the New Deal, it was evident that the socio-political credentials of monumental painting would require some rhetorical retooling in order to suit the needs of the new cultural elite. No more poor art for poor people, as Arashel Gorky famously phrased it. Large-scale painting could still take center stage, and indeed we now know that monumental painting would remain in the vanguard for years to come. And again, we just need to think about those massive canvases of the New York School. But they would take center stage under vastly different, almost unrecognizable conditions. Formally and institutionally, the public murals of the 1930s could still be admired for their formal properties, their deployment of the most advanced visual and technical strategies, especially when removed from the exigencies of history. A breathtaking case in point is Picasso's Guernica, which of course we're looking at here. Painted in horror after the Luftwaffe demonstrated their prowess by killing women and children in a civilian bombing during the Spanish Civil War. It turns out that it didn't take long for even this most virulent of anti-war statements, made in alliance with the Communist Party and the Popular Front, no less, to be transformed into a bulwark of the formalist canon, taking up residence on a wall in the Museum of Modern Art in Midtown Manhattan. The power of the white cube in silencing protest should not be underestimated. And of course, Guernica toured and didn't actually return to Spain until 1981. So it found a home within a white cube environment for just over 40 years. So the question I really want to ask today and to explore is what happened to the modernist muralism of the 1930s? We can see a process happening here. And this is where I want to segue into the afterlife of the WPA and to share with you something of my current preoccupations. And this is where well, wait a minute, what about modern art and democracy? My second project comes in. So if we have modern art, what happened to that imbuing of a democratization of culture for the artists and the artworks? Oh, I got it. Okay. Go right, young woman, go right. Okay, so this is, in many ways, the backbone of my previous research. This is Stuart Davis's Swing Landscape. Actually, if we think about the size of this screen, that would be sort of the scale we'd be thinking about. This just riotous, raucous concatenation of color and form. If you look at it for a while, you start to see that it's not entirely abstract, it's semi-abstract. And Davis, as he became well known for, was looking at motifs in the world around him. And this mural in particular for the Williamsburg complex, so it was right on the East River there. So he was thinking about masts and rigging and shipping and piers. And we can start to see some of that coming through, but of course translated into form and color that no longer are keyed to a realistic picture of the world, but to a more experiential one. I'm getting excited. This mural always excites me. Also in the title, swing. So he was very interested in jazz music and the ways in which jazz musicians would pick a theme and then go off on variations, kind of riffing on these themes. And so that's also something that he's trying to capture, in addition to just the pure joy of swing music. And then this is my photograph just of one of the entrances to the Williamsburg Housing Project. And the murals that we looked at, the studies by de Kooning and also by Krasner, were made for this same site. Okay. So we get another glimpse of the transformation that large-scale paintings were to undergo during the post-war era with Davis's swing landscape. The mural was commissioned for the Williamsburg Housing Project in Brooklyn, one of the first publicly funded housing projects in the US. The Slum Clearance Initiative was undertaken by the New York City Housing Authority, another agency created under the New Deal in 1934 to help alleviate the housing crisis during the Depression. And along with building housing, fully appointed with amenities. So there was a playground and a school, a grocery store, and art. So there were big public sculptures in the playgrounds and murals for the common rooms. So Davis was a champion of public art and was especially excited about the commission as the mural was designed for one of the communal social rooms where residents could encounter modern art on their own terms. So they didn't have to go to Midtown Manhattan and enter into this elitist institution that for many might not have felt like they were enfranchised to do. Instead, it's there with them as they come home from work, as they go out to have a pint of beer, whatever it may be. But in a betrayal of Davis's aspirations, and indeed of those of the New Deal more generally, the mural was never installed. And in fact, it's now with the Eskenazi Museum in Bloomington, Indiana. And an exhibition catalog has just come out that looks at swing and all of the related murals that were created for the housing project, all of the different muralists, some of whose names have been completely lost to us now. And again, as a result of COVID, the exhibition that's associated with that has been postponed, but as it stands now, will open in Bloomington in February 2022. By 1945, swing landscape was divested of its ties to New Deal public art and took pride of place in an exhibition at MoMA, quickly subsumed into a museum culture for which it was never intended. And this was not at all what Davis had hoped for it either. And so I'm showing you an installation view, and then this is now another installation view of a mural by Jackson Pollock from, it's dated 1943. He actually finished it in 44. In a large-scale painting exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. So we would have referred to these as murals at one point, and in fact, the image that we're looking at, this painting, Fernand Léger, a huge champion of mural painting that had a great influence on American artists, particularly modern artists working during the 1930s. So we can also see this process in action. Just as the WPA was dismantled, Jackson Pollock, like an entire generation of modernists who came of age during this era, was forced by economic necessity back into the gallery system. The patronage vacuum left by the federal projects was quickly filled by museums, dealers, private collectors, and big business. Pollock was commissioned by Peggy Guggenheim to produce a painting that would serve as the centerpiece for his first solo show in November of 1943 at her Art of the Century gallery. Pollock missed the deadline for the exhibition, and the monumental abstraction was installed in the foyer of Guggenheim's stylish new apartment in Manhattan. And that's what we can see here. And there it is. And interestingly enough, an exhibition has just closed focusing on this particular painting just at the end of August at the Guggenheim in New York. So Pollock entitled the 8 by 20 foot canvas, the largest that he would ever paint, Mural, and he insisted on this title. With its frenzied swirls and unruly brushstrokes, the painting continues to be seen by many as the breakthrough work. Somewhat hyperbolically, it has been heralded as the paradigm-shifting painting that established the New York School as the new epicenter of the international art world. Much scholarship attends to Pollock's formal innovation. And in fact, as I just noted, there another big show. It's not the first and won't be the last dedicated just to this painting. And Pollock's technical accomplishments are not at all what's at issue here. Rather, it is the significance of his conception of the painting as a mural that I want to explore with you. So Pollock's interest in wall painting was well established before he executed mural for Guggenheim. And so by way of just a very brief demonstration of this, prior to moving to New York in the autumn of 1930, Pollock spent the spring in California watching one of the Mexican muralists, Jose Clemente Orozco, paint Prometheus at Pomona College in Claremont, and that's what we're looking at here. Muralism had been instrumentalized by the Mexican government after the revolution to build unity and in fact served as the primary model for the establishment of the New Deal mural project. So Roosevelt and his advisors were looking at the Mexican mural renaissance and thinking, okay, that's clearly working. We could do with a bit of public art here too. And many of the most prominent Mexican muralists subsequently received commissions in the US, thereby offering American artists a first-hand example of monumental wall painting. And we have, to my mind, one of the finest examples of monumental fresco painting, true fresco, not too far away at the Detroit Institute of the Arts, the Rivera frescoes that were painted there at the behest of Ford in 1932. When Pollock moved east to New York, he enrolled at the Art Student League under regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton. In 1930 through 1931, he posed for Benton's America Today mural at the New School for Social Research in New York, where Orozco was actually then at work on another mural commission. And I've chosen this vignette. The entire commission has now been moved to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this figure right here is actually based on a portrait of Pollock, and Pollock's physiognomy or his particular body type appear actually throughout the mural. So this is steel, where we see Pollock in the forefront. Pollock also took advantage of the opportunity to watch Diego Rivera paint his controversial fresco Man at the Crossroads for Rockefeller Center, and saw Orozco's mural cycle, The Epic of American Civilization, at Dartmouth College. It was through the example of the Mexican muralists that American artists encountered a public art form that was at once modern, popular, and political. And of course, Rivera was a very vocal communist, even though he was kicked out of the Communist Party and then moved on to more of an embrace of Trotskyism. And if you're not familiar with this mural, which was commissioned for the foyer of the main tower in Rockefeller Center, it ultimately was destroyed. And there's been lots of rationalizing, trying to understand why. Of course, we've got figures that might be repugnant to this citadel of corporate capitalism. We have we've got Trotsky there, we've got Marx there, a range of figures that they might not wish to have adorning their hallway. But in fact, over here was the really problematic passage of the mural. So we have recognizable physiognomies of the Rockefellers, including the elder John D., who was a teetotaler, not at all someone that you would associate with what's directly above his head. These are accurate depictions of the cells for venereal disease. So once it was discovered that we were showing VD above the heads of Rockefeller, not only would it have been a problem for the Rockefeller family, but of course, those who were looking to rent the new spaces in Rockefeller Center, this doesn't really seem like such a warm welcome, in addition to all of the other communist paraphernalia that we see throughout the mural. And it was ultimately repainted. So Rivera took the money, repainted it. He did a cycle of murals for a union headquarters in New York, and then repainted it where you can still see it at the National Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City. So for Rivera, who was always very savvy with these things, it was win-win. Lots of publicity, and the mural got painted in the end anyway. Okay. In 1936, Palso also attended an experimental workshop in New York led by another of the Mexican muralists, David Alfaro Siqueiros, where Pollock collaborated on a 25-foot painting for a May Day parade. It was in this workshop, overseen by yet another outspoken communist, and indeed, we can see we've got Siqueiros here, a younger Pollock here. Siqueiros was an extremely outspoken Stalinist, so the connection between politics and large-scale painting was very evident at this moment in time. And so too was it to the McCarthyists, the Red Scares, the witch hunters. And so this is why large-scale painting needed this kind of cleansing after the fact. It was also in this workshop that Pollock first engaged in techniques such as laying a large canvas on the floor and dripping or spraying inexpensive house paints that you could buy at any hardware store to create an artwork. So these things that Pollock becomes so known for in terms of this entirely new set of methods and techniques was something that he had actually witnessed and participated in during these experimental workshops. And I'm just showing you this period photograph. This was part of the May Day parade float that they were going to be using. And right here, we've got, again, an image of the young Pollock. And the float was so big, they had to, as you can see, try to get it out of one of the upper story windows. So Pollock in front of mural. So what I want to suggest then is that entitling his canvas for Guggenheim mural, Pollock was extending, not breaking with the New Deal precedents for large-scale paintings. His mural raises the questions of painting's public life, its size and scale, inviting questions around what possible uses these works could anticipate, what viewers they expected, what spaces they were meant to inhabit, and just think of the differences between MoMA and a public housing project. What modes of address they suggested. Is this meant to be hung in your living room? Is this the same thing as easel painting? And certainly that's how museums treat these things now. And how such a structure of expectation entered into and informed the works. For large-scale painting to fulfill the requirements of a formalist ethos, it not only needed to be divested of its ties to quotidian social and political realities, it needed to foreground its internal aesthetic properties so that it was fully autonomous, encountered and understood on visual terms alone. And these are the shibboleths of post-war American art criticism. Clement Greenberg, very influential, the notion of understanding artworks by sight alone, what you can see, so that everything you need to know is encapsulated by the form, the line, the shape, and we're sort of moving away from context. So in the case of abstract painting, large-scale painting also had to steer clear of being merely decorative. And this was a terrible term of derision if your work just looked like wallpaper. So in order, if you're going to bring it in off the street, you need it to be internally coherent, to have that degree of autonomy and not be mistaken, for someone's grandmother's curtains. So clearly this process was successful. And we can see that in 1951 in this issue of Vogue magazine, which published a 4-page spread of photographs by Sir Cecil Beaton, a very well-known English fashion photographer. And so we've got 2 of Pollock's mature drip paintings, again, monumental, large scale. We've got Lavender Mist and Autumn Rhythm, and Vogue, of course, a very high-end glossy fashion magazine. So wearing the season's latest haute couture evening gowns, the models were posed in front of Pollock's mature abstract expressionist works. These photographs have actually received a fair amount of attention from important scholars. Within the art historical community, everyone knows that Pollock's were used as the backdrop for a fashion shoot, but so what? Why does it matter? I want to argue that it matters because these photographs attest, as perhaps no other images could do, the fact that an earlier approach, and we're only talking a decade, an earlier approach to large-scale modernist painting, one in which so much had been invested politically, culturally, and ideologically, had been overtaken. Let me put it another way. The Vogue photographs matter because they confirm perhaps one of the most depressing of all suspicions that we might harbor about post-war monumental painting in the US. The process that these photographs seem to glamorize is not at all glamorous by New Deal standards. Not only do they attest to the successful sidestepping of Pollock's past associations with the common man muralism of regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton, his participation on the WPA projects where the artist was a laborer like any other, and his commitment to leftist politics. But these photographs demonstrate how the radical credentials of wall painting had been ruthlessly appropriated by capitalist bourgeois culture. Job done. What Pollock thought of this, we do not know. But the profound conflict between the aspirations of the 1930s and those of the 1950s led to certain acts of unmistakable protest. And this is my final case study. So to look at one final example of the ways in which modernist wall painting was stripped of its earlier social and political credentials and allied to the new post-war agenda, it was during the mid-1950s that fellow New York School painter Mark Rothko, another artist who came of age on the WPA amidst the collectivist ferment of the Depression, was commissioned to execute some 600 running wall feet of painting for Mies van der Rohe's new international style corporate headquarters for Seagram Distillers on Park Avenue. And that, of course, is what we're looking at on the right. And the murals were to be hung on the mezzanine floor of the skyscraper in the Four Seasons restaurant, a place to see and be seen, where, in Rothko's words, and I quote, "The richest bastards in New York will come to feed." And so in many sort of cultural histories, the Four Seasons is where the power lunch was born. While initially accepting the commission and noting that his palette of dark, moody maroons and blood reds would, and again, I'm quoting Rothko in terms of the Seagram murals, would in his hopes, and I quote, "ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who ever eats in that room," end quote, while making them also, and I quote, "feel that they are trapped in an airless room where all the doors and windows are bricked up and they cannot breathe," end quote. He ultimately found the notion of his murals serving as mere mise en scène for corporate mixing and mingling literally too much to live with. So what I'm showing you here, you might not be familiar with Rothko's work for the WPA, but I think already in formal terms, you can start to see those blocks of color. And even if his treatment of pigment on surface, not a kind of like heavy impasto like we might see in a Pollock or a Davis, but these thinner veils of color and the geometric breaking into these discrete spaces. And in fact, the background has come very close to the foreground. This series of paintings, one of which I'm showing you based on studies in the subway, so how much more in the streets common people can you get? And then here I'm showing you this image of an installation of some of the Seagram murals at Tate Modern in London, just to give you a sense, again, of the size and scale. And then here, an installation view of the murals. And this is not a poor slide. Part of the bequest on the part of Rothko, he insisted that the murals be kept together. So you could never isolate one as this singular individual easel painting. Part of the gift was that they had to be hung together, that they needed to be in a room with low light and no natural light, no windows. And so, the impact of walking into this room is very, very visceral still. So Rothko canceled the contract, returned the money, kept the paintings, and instead gifted them to Tate Modern, where they continue to hang as part of the permanent collection. The murals arrived in London at the Tate the morning that Rothko was found dead in his studio, having committed suicide. Perhaps the dream of a modernism for the masses had turned into a nightmare from which Rothko now knew he couldn't wake up. By this time, Pollock was also already dead following what most believe was a suicidal drunken car crash. Many of the artists associated with the New York School had been ardent activists during the 1930s. And I'm showing you two archival photographs. This is artists out on the streets. Of course, there were lots of, I mentioned adversaries of FDR who described all of this support for culture using federal funds as boondoggling. And then as the specter of communism rose, as some kind of unpatriotic sort of activity as well. So artists actually, like other laborers, formed unions, lobbied for freedom of expression, making sure that no one had control over their content, which they were quite successful with, not all the time, but most of the time in the face of what was going on in Nazi Germany, and insisting that they were part and parcel of a truly democratic culture. And so amongst these images, all of the artists that I've been speaking about just now were all part of this. So these artists cut their teeth in the communal organizations of the WPA, where they'd established communication with a mass audience. For over a decade, they'd worked in a context in which painting was not simply a precious object or a consumable commodity. So what I'm trying to suggest is that regardless of how urgent the impulse had been to recast aesthetic practice and open art to new contexts of experience during the 1930s, the future of large-scale painting was firmly tied to the elite by what influential art critic, and I mentioned him before, Clement Greenberg, so aptly referred to as the umbilical cord of gold. For many artists, the mural had been embraced as a possible remedy to the ills of a formalist modernism. It was looked to as a possible corrective to the commodification of easel painting in the marketplace, to the loss of any sense of art's public destination, to the devolution of aesthetic aura into what Walter Benjamin described as a condition of pure exhibitionality, or even to the alienation of a modernist architecture increasingly devoid of psychological resonance. American art at mid-century suggests that at every turning point in history, it brings with it a retrospective process of reappraisal, re-dramatization, with new protagonists and new possibilities emerging. The mural form perhaps suggests an alternative framework for addressing and assessing the history of painting more generally, one which demands that questions of audience and ideology be given increased attention. There is evidence all around us that public murals remain a visible and vital presence within our contemporary moment. The renewed interest in mural painting on the part of artists associated and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement is a heartening instance of the richness and cultural potential that continues to animate a rapprochement between art and politics, especially when the writing is on the wall. Thank you. Thank you, David.
If there are any questions, we have some time for Dr. Patterson to answer questions that you might have. And since we don't have a microphone for you all in asking your questions, could I ask Dr. Patterson to repeat the question?
Absolutely. Anyone? And not just questions, comments, thoughts. Rotting vegetables.
I had a question about the Stuart Davis Newark project that was never installed. Can you give us any more background on what the circumstances were or why it was not installed there?
So this is a question that remains somewhat unanswered. So the mural was completed by 1939, and several of the murals were installed. Completely abstract artists such as Burgoyne Diller, Francis Criss, Ilya Bolotowski. They were subsequently in absolutely utter disrepair. They had been papered over, painted over, leaking pipes, so on and so forth, discovered in the 1970s, and they have been removed from the walls, conserved, restored, and now are on permanent loan at the Brooklyn Museum. And it's quite wonderful to go and have a look at them, though of course they're not at all in the context for which they were made. The Davis mural, the architect for the housing project, well known in Philadelphia, William Lescaz, was a big champion of mural painting. And you know, the more abstract, the better. And some archival materials suggest that there you know, was a little bit of pushback in terms of how abstract Davis's mural was, that it may not have, you know, appeased or appealed to all of the administrators. And then ultimately the question became a moot one, because whilst the projects officially were terminated in 1943, the last commissions were really 1939, 1940, as WPA was already the money being funneled toward war posters to support for the war effort, until of course US entry in 1941 and then final termination in 43. But even in Davis's own papers, it's not clear what the final you know, rationale was for not including it. And luckily it went immediately to a gallery setting to be exhibited as part of a broader federal art exhibition of studies for murals for the community. And then ultimately, you know, these are paid for by the taxpayers. They're public works of art. And it was put on permanent loan with the Eskenazi, and so it remains there. But these works are, you know, meant to be of the people for the people. You just have to go into a museum to go and see them. Thank you, David. Yes.